Yeah, Mesh, you can start.
Uh, Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Welcome to the Boston Study Group Ambedkar lecture series. The topic is comparisons of racism and casteism in the West and India. We have Professor Rajesh Sampath, who is an associate professor of philosophy of justice, rights, and social change at Brandeis University with us. He will be delivering his lecture on this topic. My name is Mahesh Admankar. I'm a PhD scholar at University of Massachusetts, Boston. Um, so before we begin this lecture, uh, I will introduce the Boston Study Group as well as the speaker for today, Professor Rajesh. Um, so the Boston Study Group is a registered American non-profit organization dedicated to working towards a just and equitable society. We organize study groups, monthly meetings, lecture series, and other social activities in the Boston area to create educational and organizing infrastructure to carry forward our mission. Our membership is comprised of individuals, families, students, scholars, academics, and workers who share our vision of equality and upliftment of people. We are particularly interested in creating support structures and working with students from historically marginalized backgrounds, primarily hailing from caste oppressed backgrounds. For human welfare and annihilation of caste from Buddha and Sant Ravidas, Savitri Bai Phule and Jyotiba Phule to Periyar and Ambedkar. Now let me introduce Professor Rajesh Sampath. He is a associate professor of the philosophy of justice, rights, and social change at the Brandeis University in Waltham in the greater Boston area. He completed his PhD at the University of California, Irvine in the humanities with a concentration in modern continental European philosophies of history and critical theory at the Critical Theory Institute. He studied under the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, the founder of deconstruction. His areas of specialization centered on the philosophy of history, historical time, and epochal shifts. Subsequently, he did a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of California, Berkeley, and DAD research scientist fellowship in Germany, where he published articles in continental European philosophy. From 2006 to 2009, he was an adjunct lecturer at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and continued to serve on the Provost Council for College 8 at the university until June 2012. His current research interests and disciplinary expertise include 20th century Anglo-American and continental European moral and political philosophy, political theories of modernization and social historical change, comparative constitutional law and legal philosophy, epistemology, and the sociology of knowledge in comparative religious studies, particularly as it affects modalities of social exclusion and inclusion, and comparisons of Western philosophy and various philosophical traditions in the global South. He teaches courses on social theory, critical race theory, intersectionality, global queer and gender studies, bioethics, Anglo-American, European, and global South traditions of philosophical ethics, human rights, and theories of justice when applied to sustainable development issues. So you can read more about him from the Brandeis University website. Thank you, Professor Rajesh, for joining us. And so you'll be speaking for next 30 minutes, 30 to 40 minutes on this topic, followed by the question, answer, and comment section. So I'll open up this forum for question, answers, and comments after like 40 minutes. You can raise your hand. You can put your questions in the chat. Yeah, that's it for now. I hand over the stage to Professor Raj.
Thank you, Mahesh, for the kind introduction. Can everybody on Zoom hear me okay? Is this clear? Good, yeah. Okay.
Yes.
I want to thank Sanjay and the Boston Study Group, and also apologize. Sanjay knows I've had to miss many events over the past 2 years, not just because of COVID, but because my wife and I welcomed a new child 11 months ago. But I have been thinking about all the events and the honoring of Dr. Ambedkar and his birth and the legacy. And those of you that know my work, I continue to publish and write and try to advocate in terms of anti-caste policy, anti-caste discrimination policies everywhere. But I just haven't been as present as I'd like to be, and I hope to do so this year and in the coming years. So thank you all for joining us. I will present for 30 minutes, maybe less, because I'm more interested in hearing from you and having a kind of collective discussion about our own experiences with regard to both race and caste, which we'll talk about today. And the reason I've been researching this area for the last few years is twofold. One is personal. As a second generation growing up here, I can witness my parents as immigrants, and many of you, and you can discuss with your children who are growing up here, the differences between generational experiences when it comes to racism and xenophobia, just growing up in Western democracies, in our case, the United States. So the immigrant generation has an experience as adults, and growing up as kids, we have our own experiences, which we may or may not articulate, to the parents. But inversely, as South Asians, particularly Indians, we have this trinket system of caste. And if we compare and contrast the way it's discussed in the Indian context, let's say when I have conversations with my cousins growing up there, compared to the Indian Americans here in the West, there's subtle differences in the way we discuss the issue, but also how we compare the question of caste with this experience of racism. So that's kind of the broad background. And what I'm trying to explore now is, it's obvious to talk about racism of non-white minority groups, particularly the Black experience, the long history of oppression from slavery to the present, the Native American experience, and then Asian Americans, Latin Americans, et cetera, et cetera. But what's more intriguing, and this is part of the conversations I'm having with different groups around the world, what's more intriguing is when we start talking about racism and concepts of race and constructions of race in the global South, in the East. So it's not white versus non-white, but let's say, the Hindutva majority in terms of Hindu nationalism, vis-a-vis, first of all, non-Indus peoples, but then we can look at the kind of boundaries between religion and caste and race just within the South Asian context. So that's what I really want to explore. We will, of course, talk about caste. We will talk about the legacy of Ambedkar and Phule and Peria, all the other major influential figures that Mahesh mentioned. But now we have to have the more uncomfortable conversation as well regarding the post-colonial inheritance of both constructions of race from the British Empire and racism today. You say, well, no, there's no racism. It's the racism is in the West. Yeah, that's usually how we think. But we're going to try to figure out what are the kind of interweaving strands between race and caste. So let me share the PowerPoint. And if you can please let me know if you can see this. So can everyone see my PowerPoint? It's pretty clear?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent, good. My thesis coming into this work, and it's through a series of interviews, because truth be told, in my university context, the student demand, especially American students of color, Black Americans, Latino Americans, the rare Native Americans when I have a chance to meet and discuss with groups, the interest has been on critical race theory. How do we think about structural racism across the US history? And I wonder why there are attempts to compare that experience of racism by non-Indian peoples, slavery in Native American genocide, the border politics, with when they come into contact and learn about the Indian history, about caste, and meeting those of us that are part of the oppressed groups within the caste system, particularly the Dalit experience. It's interesting to see this dialogue. Martin Luther King visited India. He had the dialogue. W.E.B. Du Bois and Ambedkar had a dialogue in the first half of the 20th century. So there's already a relationship there. But when we come to the Western context, I'm very curious as to how caste is hidden. We don't talk about it. Only in the last few years have the institutions taken some strides in trying to pass anti-caste discrimination policies. Different universities, and now you know the progress with the Seattle at the city level. Maybe it's going to go to the state level, eventually the national. Now there's an emergent consciousness, but for the longest time, there's caste, and it's very present, and you all know it because we've all faced the various forms of exclusion, perhaps discrimination on the basis of caste here in the West. But we're busy talking about the racism, but we're not talking about the caste. But inversely, in the South Asian context, when we go there, we may be talking about caste politics and the long history and the complexity and the richness of it. Many of us are doing research on it. Rajesh are doing a PhD. But how do we talk about race? Racism? No, there's no racism. That's a Western problem. So I'm living in the intersectionality of these conversations. This is how I'm coming to the work. But let's take a step back. Let's first of all try to discuss what we mean by race in general. So in the 19th century, obviously, in the peak of imperialism and colonization, when Darwinian science, Darwin and evolutionary theory were also born, of course, the West created their biological constructions of white Western superiority, and then kind of stratifying. They're obsessed with this issue of race and classifying and stratifying. And that spills over into the 20th century. So we may have gotten rid of this biological notion of the superiority of one race over others. But then why do we have these classification systems in most Western democracies, not France? And then since the civil rights movements of the 60s, it took another couple of decades, but then something like critical race theory was born, saying, wait a minute, we may have civil rights and racial progress, and we may talk about, we may write the history in a certain way, but the very legal system, all the systems in society are still drenched in this injustice of exclusion, in which the law is not applied equally to all groups. In a democracy, how can that be? Now, keep in mind what's happening in the post-colonial context in India, the Gandhi and Ambedkar days. We'll come to that, but just here in the West, the critical race theory was born to respond to the failures of the system. We want to look at this context, but we also want to look at the global South and the US, the South Asian context, particularly India, the post-colonial and neo-colonial realities. Most social scientists today don't believe in the biological definition. Maybe some KKK neo-Nazi types still believe in the essential superiority. Most people today believe that it's a social construction. There's absolutely no difference in the human species. We look different, be different geographies and racial complexions, et cetera, but as a species, we interbreed. There's no problem, unlike the animal species where they can mix two species. We're one species, we're one people. 99.9% of ourselves. There are more differences within a single racial group than there are between, because the layers of mixing over history, the legacy of slavery. So it's nonsense to talk about these racial differences, but obviously some people persist. The 6 major paradigms that social scientists have been grappling with, and it'd be very interesting to compare your understanding of race and racism and your understanding of caste and casteism. 2 different democracies, US and Indian, and try to see what the kind of progress is. 1948 for India, 1965 for the US, civil rights, desegregation, 1956. So, of course, the US is much older, India is much younger as a democracy, but I'm talking about the post-war period, post-colonial period. Very simple. What are some of the paradigms here? Well, according to Bonilla Silva, if you look at today, maybe the majority of white Americans would believe in racial optimism. We're making progress. We elected a black president. You know, there's more diversity in society. The generation millennials and Gen Z, anyone under the age of 40, under the age of 25, look around. Who are your kids? Look at the kids. We're diverse. Whites are already going to be a minority. So we're making progress. Well, some will say, okay, let's not be too optimistic because there's a pessimistic optimistic, peso-optimist. Sure, we believe in advancing civil rights, desegregation, equality in the job markets, anti-discrimination, interracial marriage. Oh, yes, we believe in all these things. Protecting voting rights, perhaps reparations for past injustices. Well, what are we doing about it? What are the politicians doing about it? What's civil society doing about it? You are a brave NGO trying to advance anti-casteism. But we should have 1 million organizations all fighting at the same time to get the real progress. Okay, let's say we achieve the progress. What do we do with the stigma? This is a very difficult question. Ambedkar really probed that in all his writings. Symbolic racism. What is that? Well, I don't believe in the biological differences. I don't believe in the mythological systems, the Manusmriti, for example, caste, or whatever the Shastras are saying about the fundamental differences of the caste, and each one has to stick to their duty. Ambedkar exploded all those ideas. He exposed the mythological dimensions. But somehow the feeling, the psychological feeling that no, I think some groups are more industrious, smarter, less corrupt, more pure, impure distinction. Symbolic. White people may think, some white groups may unconsciously feel, okay, racial minorities, immigrant groups, they're different. I believe we're equal, but somehow there's some kind of differences. And similar with the caste, there's differences between the Brahmanic purity and then everyone else. But you ask the average person, no, I believe in democratic equality. Sense of group position is, even if you want to believe in all this progress and equality, people still snap back to what's most comfortable for them, what maintains comfort, equilibrium, doesn't cause stress, staying within your own groups. Here's some debates we can have. I'd love to hear about this. The answer is free market capitalism. There's no free market capitalism. It's all regulated. It's the Indian and the US. And we're also caught in this globalization picture, competing with an empire like China. But in principle, let the market decide. Market does not discriminate. This is the quote unquote beauty of capitalism. I don't believe in the beauty of capitalism, but many people do. You want the lowest wages and the highest profits. Therefore, you don't care who's doing the work. You shouldn't discriminate on the basis of descent and work, like caste. Let everybody compete. That'll erase all the differences and inequalities. That hasn't happened. There is a monopolistic control of political and economic capital. All the reservations that were promised in caste in India. I was reading about this. Higher education, parliamentary seats, local governance, small businesses. Oh yeah, all that was promised. The Atrocities Act of the mid-90s, different political parties. What's the actual outcome? What's the reality? Have those seats been achieved in higher ed? No, especially for the Dalit representation. Laissez-faire. Right? Lastly, psychological is that let's not talk about structural racism or society. It's really individual psychology. If we work on the human brain and the mind and change the bad behavior of certain individuals, change the way they think, then we can get to some level of equality. Bonilla Silva says these ways of thinking some people may fall into these different paradigms, but he's trying to say he's kind of concerned. And he's writing in the late 2000s after started in the 90s, but the work really the ideas came to full expression then when President Obama was elected. And Bonilla Silva says we're moving into a new age in the Western context, the US context. Bonilla Silva is himself of Afro-Puerto Rican descent, so he understands the Latin American context, but also the oppression of Black people. He lives at the intersection. So he's bringing this background into this study. What happens if we move into a colorblind racism? There's racism, but we pretend that we don't see race. What is societal and structural racism? We know what individual racism is: hate crimes, hate speech, an individual act of discrimination in the workplace, A microaggression, you go to the grocery stores and someone doesn't want to serve you or looks at you differently. Microaggression, when we talk about that. No, we want to talk about the macro, the structural. Look at this one, post-racial racism. Well, how can you have a post-racial racism? And by the way, we're going to get to it, but substitute these words racism for caste. Caste blind casteism. Societal and structural casteism. Post-caste casteism. Caste structure. Caste ideology. So let's look at both. Bottom line is that for him, there is, like for many Marxists, even though he's not a Marxist, there's a base structure of material reality that reproduces itself. It hides the fact that this structure of labor and commodification and the production of wealth, all that sounds great, but it's hiding through ideology and presenting a different reality to the people. Saying, well, whether it's through the state or through religion or through civil society or through the family values or through the communities, this belief that all these great things are happening at the base level when the reality, the actual reality, is inequality and oppression. So what Bonilla still is saying is that it's becoming more subtle and invisible, the mechanisms of racism. We don't really see it. It's not Jim Crow segregation. It's not the white mobs acting with impunity with the lynchings of Black people. It's not the Native American genocide. It's become more invisible. I want you to think about caste dynamics, those of you that would be more familiar and know what's happening in the Indian context, perhaps South Asia in general, and those of us that live here in the US and are trying to fight the battle here on anti-caste discrimination. We have to make some differences, though. We can't conflate the two, especially when you think of the UN and Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, those of us that are concerned about human rights. It may look easy, you may be tempted to conflate racism with caste. And the conflation is not simply that, well, for example, we South Asians, when we come to the West, will face racism. You all have your own stories. I have plenty of stories growing up, especially as a Gen X. But we also have the legacy of caste, or we have the reality of caste, and we're all trapped in it because those of us that are, and even if we converted to Islam or Christianity or Buddhism, we still have that stigma that carries over. But for the most part, we're born in a Hindu structure, like many of us have. We were born in this horror house, this castle of horrors, as Ambedkar says. You can't go from one level to the other. You're trapped on your floor, birth to death. You may want to conflate the two, but they're not. So how's race different? Today, you can't say necessarily it's like the caste system, where there's observable segregation spatial systems. Dalits not being able to traverse into the temple, or drinking from the same well, or going from one village to another. It kind of looks like the feudal ages, the Middle Ages of the West, and Jim Crow segregation in America. But inversely, in the US, we have this de facto segregation. Even though segregation is illegal, Black communities, white communities, which is more advanced, which is less resourced, where do the taxpayer dollars go? And think about that with regard to the distribution of opportunities and wealth in the Indian context. So there's segregation that functions for caste, but there's also, is it a post type of segregation, if you will, some kind of de facto segregation, colorblind racism, as Bonilla says. Many groups around the world are trying to look at the caste concept in India, but finding the different groups have their own histories. The feudal order in Japan, the Roma people in Europe, intergenerational slavery exists in India, Nepal, and many others, but many African countries, Mauritania. Caste is not slavery necessarily. Yes, of course, it involves descent. Identities are assigned to us at birth, and then we are forced into certain occupations because we're not given the opportunity to leave that. But how does that happen with regard to race and racism? Birth-based hierarchies. That's what a birth-based hierarchy is. And for me, when I think of the critique of Hindu metaphysics, the paradox of it, okay, in an individual life, if you try to do as much good as possible, you should be able to keep transcending from one caste to another in the next life, reincarnation, and achieve the bodhisattva, eventually the ahimsa. That's the Buddhist concept. But this whole sense of transcendence from body and to super consciousness and to be one with the absolute being, right? So you escape the cycle of rebirth and death. You should be moving up. So how do you have an intergenerational structure that doesn't change? It's a paradox. You're supposed to have the opportunity to keep leaving one caste to another. And yet every generation, there's only one group born into that caste and cannot escape from it, as Ambedkar said. He, of course, in many of his writings, exploded this paradox. So we have to come to grips with this. What do we mean by assigning an identity at birth? Let's also differentiate caste and race from the long-going struggle of tribal and indigenous peoples. We can think of the Advaita in the Indian context, or we can think of Native American peoples in the US context. That's a pre-colonial structure that had its own autonomous space. There was no question of race because the Europeans hadn't made contact and been conquered. The dynamics, I don't want to get into it. There's many anthropological works on the comparisons of tribal configurations. Taboo, for example, is totem and taboo is Levi-Strauss try to distinguish from the phenomenon of caste. A lot of us are concerned about caste, pure, impure distinctions, segregated labor. The mythological story that Hinduism tells about the origins of this, the attempt to justify it, with this notion of detachment and ahimsa, do the duty, leave the fruits to God. So we can learn from the experiences, but we can't conflate that. And then I'm very concerned today, as all you are, the rise of ethno-nationalism everywhere. After Trump, it's white nationalism. How scary is that? The Nazis are 80 years ago, 70 years ago. Well, what is this resurgence of white superiority? Look at the right-wing movements in European parliaments. Italy just elected right-wing. Of course, in Europe, they're concerned about decolonization. All the colonized empires now, all the peoples are moving into Europe. They're thinking about multi-generational Muslim populations. They have their own issues with race, and I don't want to compare the European context, Western European context, with the US, but they have their own concerns. Here we have the long-standing history of Black oppression, and then the oppression of other racial and ethnic groups as they came into the US, and of course the Native Americans genocide. But there is this neo-fascism. Well, I want you to think about Hindu nationalism. No. The Indian Constitution, as I'll mention in my last point here, in the genius that Ambedkar chaired the Constitution, but he himself, as we know, was not happy that it didn't really fulfill the full potential, which was the elimination of caste altogether. But let's look at the language. U.S. no discrimination on the basis of race, but there's no amendment that bans racism. Indian Constitution, for sure, ban untouchability, ban discrimination on the basis of caste, but no banning of the caste system. Think about that. So what does that say about the law? Oh yeah, we have formal legal systems. We have Supreme Courts that have to decide things. Well, what's the reality in society? So on top of that, to have the social structure stay the same and to have these neo-fascist kind of movements relishing in the superiority of certain groups and positively taking the rights away from the minorities. Let's debate this. There's going to be a debate about affirmative action in America. There's going to be a debate in the Indian context about reservations. So what do we have to come to grips with? Conclusions. I'll be wrapping up in a few minutes here. These are the things I have to think about with the other groups, and it's a lot. I know we want to stay focused and have some concluding remarks about race and caste, but there's a history here, at least for racial justice. Thank goodness, with the UN, 1965, very early, 82 indigenous. If you've heard of Durban, racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia related to intolerance, 2001. So think about that. Apartheid was demolished in the 90s, South Africa. But you may not know this. There's a New Delhi conference who wanted to be a part of that UN discussion. So, okay, yeah, let's talk about racism, but don't forget caste. This is back in 2001. Let's talk about caste oppression too. Let's have a discussion about the relationship between the two. As I mentioned, today we can't ignore the fact there's no British Empire. You can't just blame them. but there is race and racism in the post-colonial context, even if no white people are around. Global South and Eastern context. What is that? I'm concerned about the treatment of migrants. How about the Assam border? What about anti-Blackness in general throughout Asia, the Middle East? What do Black people have to face? People of African descent. There's a whole UN convention just focusing on that. It's not just a Western, you can't just blame the West for that racism. Let's have an honest conversation. Is this even possible? Was the US, Brazil, or India, their democratic constitutions, they're all amazingly diverse historically. There's no kind of diversity like that. You can't compare it to Scandinavia and 80%, 90% majority white. Of course, they have a growing minority population. They have their own issues. But we already, I told you, the millennial generation here, majority non-white, majority minority, 40 and under. Gen Z, 10 to 25 years old. Now, the new generation, 0 to 10, even more diverse. How do you have that diversity and democratic equality? This is something Ambedkar struggled with in the Indian context, in his case, caste, and of course, Du Bois and many others up to Martin Luther King and beyond. Are we ever going to really achieve that equality? Not just promise it. Let's not forget about which was in Ambedkar's great insight for caste, the alliance between Brahmanism and patriarchy. There's no way we can advance, for me, and I firmly believe this, any kind of democratic equality anywhere if half the population doesn't have the same opportunities and rights, women in general. And by extension, we can say queer people, the full decriminalization and full legalization, just the right to life, the right to be free to express yourself. You may have different views, but I'm telling you, my perspective is that I can't imagine any real discussion about democratic equality if we don't talk about gender rights and queer rights. People fighting for rights. Peoples with disabilities, disabled peoples. Immigrant groups. And we talked about the right-wing authoritarianism. And this is where we want to conclude. The relationship between race and religion in the West is very long. European colonizers brought their Christianity, tried to convert both the Black slaves from Africa, the Spanish and Portuguese in Latin America, Global South. You may not know this. Islam is the fastest growing religion, yes. It's still the most, in terms of numbers, but Christianity is still quite prominent. Obviously the second largest, but not far behind. Christianity is in the Global South. It came from that legacy. And those of us that are critical of caste, we're very busy trying to figure out what is the Hindu origins, what is this issue of conversion for many groups, even if they try to leave, go into Christianity, Islam, Buddhism. What about the stigma of caste, especially for the Dalit groups when they go into the new religion? So we have to have a conversation about religion. We can't ignore it, which means culture. And then if it's conceivable, I saw a very interesting presentation the other day. I'm shocked because I know about the history of weaponizing environmental policies to further impoverish peoples and subject them to intergenerational health issues. That's part of the stratification system in the US. Think about Black inner cities and Black rural communities, Latinx versus more rich metropolitan, white, and for the most part, Asian American too, privilege. But then let's think about pollution, the landfills and the slums, and this massive concentration of poverty throughout different spots in cities and states in India. Who's going to be affected the most? Obviously, the lower caste, particularly the Dalits. So I can't exclude this question of environmental racism. Okay, so I'll stop sharing, and my final concluding remark, I can think about it, is racism may start with this physical difference, this perception of difference. But as a socially constructed category, that's bad enough. Then you can say, well, how are we supposed to stop that? That's just something that happens naturally. What's worse is when there's an attribution by society and governments and media and culture to say some groups are this way and some groups are that way. And therefore some groups may be better and some groups are inferior. So that's the history. That's a very simplistic statement about racism. Caste, if you can't reduce it to the physical dimension, especially if those of us that live in the Western societies, it's not as simple as being identified. If we don't talk about our caste, if we don't articulate that we're not Brahmin, people may not know. We have to come to consciousness, as Ambedkar says, have the courage to speak with pride as the broken. Because as many great leaders, he's one, of course, but I think of Martin Luther King, and I think of in the Black experience in America, W.E.B. Du Bois and Frederick Douglass. Du Bois's great statement, you're othered. First of all, as a child, you don't know. You're just playing and you can't see differences. Kids, babies don't see that. Then at some point in time, if you're part of the oppressed, some majority is going to other you and say you're different. And for him, this veil goes up and you're forced to see the world through the eyes of others. Then you're torn apart, to be Dalit, but be fully equal as an Indian citizen, to be a person of color in the US, but be fully equal with white privilege. Two consciousnesses, as Du Bois says, and you struggle. Can they come together? Can we undo that moment of being othered from the beginning? But he goes, out of that oppression grows a second insight, where you get to use this power like a superhero to think new ideas and systems. And I believe that's what Ambedkar was doing with caste. We have to debate that. Separate electorate, the political economic differentiation, the abolishing the caste system altogether. Yes, we'll talk about that, but I also want to get into the depths of what he was saying in his philosophy of Hinduism, riddles of Hinduism, the last piece, Buddha and Karl Marx. That's the question I want to leave for the group. Can we ever abolish the caste system, which is now being racialized in the West, and also, if we want to bring up race in the South Asian context, can we ever abolish the caste system if we do not reform the internal structure of culture and religion? You may say Hinduism, but quite frankly, all the world religions that are present in the South Asian context. Can you ever get rid of caste if you do not take on this issue of reform? Meaning putting, as Ambedkar says, the dignity away from the divinity and the protectors of divine knowledge back to the individual in the individual body. The individual has to be seen as equal. Do you think that can happen? What needs to change? That's my concluding question. So thank you. And I appreciate your time. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Professor Rajesh, for really very thoughtful lecture reflection on this important topic. Particularly giving this both historical, philosophical, and the current reality-based understanding. Yeah, I don't know the answer to your question. You raised a very important question, but I hope we hear more, we reflect more from others. So we have some people raised their hand. So Gaurav, please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Professor Sampath.
Hi,
nice
Professor. Hi,
yeah.
Professor Gaurav. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you after a long time. Yeah, and what a brilliant presentation. And the question that you raised, I'm just want to have thinking of when you think of the idea of religion, for example, in the context of race, and so the Christianity ideologically did not support race. It's being misused that way. And because then why I'm saying is that because when you look at the anti-racism movement, like for example, we can't think of the emergence of MLK without the support of the Christian church, right? So in that way, when you look at now compared with the caste, how can actually we, again, it's kind of your question also, but I'm kind of thinking in this way, that is there any way that religion can be used or to annihilate caste? Because here, in unlike race, here or unlike Christianity, Hinduism is kind of is a protective shell in which actually caste breeds, and so it's a religion is a protective cover. So how can we actually use now? And it actually leads to the another question of, like, even if we use the Buddhism as a way to emancipate, do you think that it would lead us somewhere in the form of annihilation of caste, or doing some kind of anti-caste activism? So can we use religion as a category of emancipation?
Yes, liberation theology. Gaurav, those are such pristine insights, always coming from you. Let's take a few more perspectives, but I'm gonna come back to your massive set of reflections. We'll hear from Rajesh, and if we want to hear some others first, and then I'll come back. But yes, lots to say about that issue. Rajesh, please.
I can go. Mahesh, I can go.
Yeah, that
is yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah. Sir Sampath Garu, thank you so much. I live outside Boston. So this topic is very disturbing topic, and very passionate topic, very painful topic. Despite that, your calmness, your objectivity, your presentation is really appreciated.
Thank you.
And here is my question: the people of our own, country, they come to America, especially, and they come to Western countries, but I'm in America talking about America. They come here and they express solidarity to blacks. And they go to rallies, they say, Black Lives Matters. But these same people, so-called educated people, intellectuals, in India, they outrightly discriminate, oppress the fellow Indians. Are they logical in their thinking? And what makes them to feel empathy to these blacks when they are oppressing their own color citizens? So that's first part of question. Second part of question, since you're part of this academic system, what can be done through academics, research, education to educate these illiterates? Thank you, sir.
It's an amazing question, Rajesh. I will come back to that as well. It already got me thinking about some pieces in the relation to caste. I want to invoke some Ambedkar moments, and we have to work through that on the race caste. But you're right, the hypocrisy. Let's get to this issue. It's very painful, as you said, but we have to put the mirror up. Thank you. Maya, if you want to call on others, then we'll take the two other folks.
Yeah, Sonny, Matthew, please go ahead. Yeah.
I'm sorry I don't have my camera on today. Thank you, Professor Sampath. That was so enlightening. My question is in regards to the hierarchies. We cannot move away from established hierarchies. And then the biological identities also is another fact. We can't escape from that. And so it gives the perception that certain people on the top are oppressing the folks who are not at the top, right? So we have those tensions which go on. And so my personal view is that it is the individual's responsibility, which you alluded to, individual responsibility, how you carry yourself in your space, so to speak, in terms of how you conduct yourself in relation to others will make the most important aspect into moving towards not a total eradication. That's just not a reality, realistic expectation, but at least moving towards that ideal. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonny. Thank you. Well, individual disposition, even though we can't deal with a race structural difference. Yes, Venkat or Mahesh is Venkat
maybe
next?
I can go. Thank you, Professor Sampath, for a very thoughtful and insightful work you've been doing on this. Racism and casteism. There's a lot to learn from how the struggle against racism, yielded some very, very successful positive results in it, especially in the United States. There's a lot to learn from that to apply, to the caste, which we all feel hasn't got its due attention in the academic circles globally. Also, other parts of the world haven't been sensitized, and what we're seeing is the very, very early stages of that. A lot of scholars getting interested, as well as what we're seeing, in America in the last couple of years. These universities recognizing caste as a protective category. What we have seen in Seattle. So it's a wonderful thing that is happening. Still early stages. So that way, you trying to enlighten this, that's actually a very important field of work, academic work you guys are undertaking. But my question is, invariably, religion played a big role even in the colonial times, okay? While I agree with, my dear friend Gaurav said, yes, church supported a lot with anti-racism, and what MLK products are, purely out of the church, and, Christianity was solid, they gained big support to be successful. But at the same time, what they have done in Africa and other parts of the world, the colonial powers, I'm not talking about the people and society, but the colonial rulers and powers, religion was did bad things, okay? Very bad things. A lot of human suffering was imposed because of religion. And what we are seeing in India with the casteism is, in my view, is direct result of, how the Hinduism is constructed, especially post-Ambedkarite, post-Buddhism. So, I keep struggling all the time. I know, because you're is religion important in this modern society, or has religion done more harm to the human society over the years, or anything good it has done? It just I struggle, and the modern society with a lot of science and technology, and a lot of people, the second, if you were to count all the atheists as, say, it would be the second largest religion. So any light you can throw on that, okay? I would really appreciate it. Yeah.
I think it comes back to Gaurav's initial statement about religion, and now you're offering also a powerful reflection, Venkat. These are the big questions that a lot of people struggle to answer. Why don't we pause here? I know we only have about 11 minutes, and I don't want to continue, and I want to be able to open up if there's a chance for more questions. I also want to be mindful of what came through the chat. So if everyone has a chance to read that. Purity pollution, the color blindness for the caste systems, systemic memory, the increasing politicization of caste, true, still happening. And invocation of Ambedkar's annihilation of caste. Will the country loser if you can reset the caste button? Interesting question. Govind, super at the racialization of caste. Well, Karl Marx helped me. Yeah, he does. That was Bonilla Silva's point. The base can pretend to offer through religion and everything else all these solutions, but in fact, let's look at the base structure itself. What's happening to material bodies? What's the process of exploitation, alienation of consciousness and labor, etc. So that draws from the old Marxist critique. Ambedkar's philosophy of Hinduism, and if you can indulge me, I began as a philosopher, I wanted to do a commentary on this discovered manuscript. It wasn't published in his lifetime. And of course, we know the last piece was the Buddha and the Karl Marx. But the philosophy of Hinduism, not the riddle of Hinduism, not the Buddha and the Dharma, of course, the annihilation of caste. And if you go to I don't know, I think it's the Maharashtrian government, that has the 17 volumes on the website. You can see the big, the genius that Ambedkar was. 17 volumes, each one 1,000 pages. And that's all we know about the published materials. What about discovering the manuscripts? But it was this philosophy of Hinduism that remained incomplete, only 92 pages. But I look at the first 22 pages, and I think we should begin there. It's so easy for historians to go back and blame the British Empire and say, look, they racialized the caste system. They found it. They thought it was useful. You have to divide and conquer, just like they did for the African countries during colonization. You can put the chiefs in and the tribes and make up these different distinctions that obviously had a more complex history before colonization, and use that as the instrumental power, use others to control the society. So similarly, if you find this nice caste system with the 3% controlling pretty much the levers of power, the top 10%, Brahmin Kshatriya, why reinvent the wheel? Just use that. But being outsiders with their Western framework and their white lens of looking at non-whites through this racist racial lens, oh, how come darker people are this, and how come lighter skinned people are this and that? Ambedkar already deconstructs that. The caste is almost beneath race, within just the Indus structure. Because then we can talk about the Indus structure being racist towards non-Indus peoples, Asian peoples like the Assam border, Black people everywhere, other racial migrants, Asian people coming for work within India, but also celebrating, the whiteness as the pinnacle of achievement, white creams, white fairness, commodification whiteness, Bollywood, et cetera, et cetera. But Ambedkar had an interesting insight already in the Annihilation of Caste, 1936. A Muslim or a Sikh sees a fellow Muslim, regardless of any kind of class or status or this or geography or racial complexion, and if in need, they'll come to their help right then and there. But the apathy of the Hindu caste system is that if you see the lower caste suffering, you either don't do anything, and even worse off, you enjoy it. That's like, oh, see, that's your dharma and karma. Because the white lens, Western lens, cannot see that within the structure, you can have an alliance between Brahmins who may be darker skinned in the south, for example, with lighter skinned Brahmins in the north, or lighter skinned Brahmins in the south, et cetera, because the bond is based on caste and it's open. It seems that way. So the British can misperceive and say, oh, well, we see darker people, they must be working in the fields and because of the sun, and therefore they have the lower caste function. That's not true. That's what we have to tell ourselves. Oh, they brought the racism and put it on top of the caste system. So that's one of the points. Ambedkar takes a step back and says, wait a minute. He wants to know what religion is. This guy, this is the genius of the man. I don't know of a single individual. Quite frankly, when I give talks on all the great thinkers of the different traditions and contexts, you can talk about MLK, you can talk about Malcolm X, you can talk about even Ho Chi Minh in his context. But when I think about that, how do you write the Constitution? Get a PhD in economics, work with John Dewey with a PhD in anthropology and philosophy at Columbia, and then go somehow and start the movement, and then to have the time to actually, without being a philosopher, but having a great philosophical mind, try to get into the depths, given how much he studied before he made that fateful decision to leave Buddhism, the mass conversion. But he looked at it and he says, okay, what I noticed about world religions from the beginning of time to now is, and I don't know when and how, and I'm not saying, hey, let's give credit to Islam and Christianity and Judaism for doing this, the Abrahamic faiths, the monotheistic faiths. Or if we think of the Eastern faiths, we think of Buddhism, and we think of some offshoots and amalgamations, we think of creative departures, other traditions, or if you think about Confucianism in China. But with the exception of Hinduism, it looks like there was this massive shift in history where the community that creates the divinities out of fear because they couldn't explain obviously there's no modern scientific explanation of things, but out of fear had to attribute cause and effect relationships to nature to some power. The power inversely does not center the welfare of the human being in that system. So that's how the ancient systems were. It took some shift, and he's trying to understand this, to make the human being and their welfare and the care and the compassion for the human being's welfare the center of religion. And that can manifest itself differently. It manifests itself differently for Judaism and Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. The modern scientific age that we live in, that we can use to explain nature, obviously destroys this fear-based model of using religion to explain what happens in the world. And the shift to individual rights for individual salvation, Protestantism did that with Christianity. Islam in general broke from the tribal structures of the Arab world. And credit to Judaism and its 10 commandments to lay down those principles, first of all. And of course, it speaks about fearing God and also not sacralizing the name or image of God. But it really, at the concern of the story, if you listen to it or look at it, is a person can concerned with their enslaved people, a God concerned for his enslaved people under Egypt. So, Gaurav, you mentioned that the liberation piece has to be there. How do we find it? So let's come back to this question of caste and religion. Let's leave aside that Ambedkar couldn't complete the text. And then, of course, he says, I'm putting Hinduism on trial because I want to use the criteria of utility. Is it useful for human beings? Does it promote justice? We all know, look, many of us are not lawyers. We're not constitutional professors of law. We're not sitting on the Supreme Court, so we don't just study the law all day long. But we know what it's like to be in a culture. We know what it's like to be born into a body. And we know what it's like to experience casteism and racism. So I think if the issue is a reformation of Hinduism, if you look at the preface in which he opens up the last conferences in which he's really struggled, can I really try to achieve this within Hinduism, or do I have to leave before the decision to leave to Buddhism? That's not the only question, is conversion. The question is, if the Shastras, which is the structural definition of divine salvation, is based on a duty-based structure to maintain your position in the social system. And then I look at Christianity being brought from the West to justify colonization and slavery and to convert Black slaves. And then the Black population in America reappropriating that for their liberation, because that's what was given. It can't go back to the pre-colonial African religions from the beginning. Slavery is 400 years old in this country. That first conversion, yes, white supremacy justified their own moral atrocity of enslavement by offering Christianity, which was then taken. But do we have a similar dynamic with regard to Hinduism and the Gandhi and Ambedkar debates? Can it promise the reservation or equality or this constitutional notion will ban the untouchability, but not change the everyday reality? So the Western context about race, the appropriation of Christianity as a liberatory movement, is different from this question of if we can think of it. And I'm very curious to meet. I wish I could go back to India. I haven't been in a while, mostly because of COVID. But I've asked for friends to introduce me to Dalit Christians, Dalit Muslims, Dalit Buddhists, liberation theology groups. I want to go meet them and try to understand better what resources do we have within there. And then how do we have a peaceful interfaith dialogue within the Dalit communities that remain within the Hindu structure. And then lastly, I'm very interested, because I've seen some documentaries about a pre-colonial, in a way pre-Hindu, if you want to start with the Manusmriti, and if the epics are like 300-400 BC, Upanishads are 800 BC, and of course the Vedas are, the claim is that they're thousands of years old. But an independent strand that's not the tribal indigenous knowledge that you find with the Adivasis and their cosmology and spirituality, but a separate Dalit consciousness and liberation that's not Hindu and certainly not Islam and Christian, and therefore Hindu and Buddhist eventually, and a separate philosophy. And if it's not there, can we I don't want to say create it or invent it. Can we conceptualize this alternative spirituality? And my instinct with Ambedkar tells me, yes, it's possible. He took Buddhism, but in the very end, he also tried to say, look, communism promises equality of labor and resources, very important at the material level. But the 20th century communist societies created dictatorial and centralized states. Buddhism promises individual liberation. But who's come up with a Buddhist theocracy? We want to turn to Myanmar as an example because that's a collusion with the military against the Muslim minority. It's not the example we want to think of. Or think about the Sinhalese Buddhist Tamil conflict, Hindu conflict in Sri Lanka. You know, can we think of a Buddhist state? And Ambedkar says, well, I don't know. I don't know how to think about that. Marxism offers the economic liberation. Buddhism offers the salvific or individual liberation from internal mental oppression, from desire. How can I bring them together? My fear is that whether it's the minoritization of whiteness in this country, we have to avoid moving into an apartheid because we're a minority majority state society. I'll say already, because the baby boomers are going to get older. But where is the real concentration of power? And inversely, I'm not convinced that we've advanced the liberation of 200 to 300 million Dalits, 70 million Advaisa, and let's say what, out of the 800 million Hindus, well, 1.3 billion. India just passed to China. But let's say how many Sudra, 400, 500 million. And then I have to think about the plights of Muslims and Christians of all castes. My bullet point here, I don't have it up, pluralistic, diverse, multi-religious, multicultural, democratic system based on individual and group rights, but destroying the essentialization of individuals and groups on the basis of race and caste. How do we have that? I'm very critical, as you all know. I'm not happy with the progress of American democracy. And I can say, I guess I know this is being recorded, but I'm not happy with the progress of 70 to 80 years of democratic possibility in the Indian context for the one simple reason. I've read and have been transformed by Ambedkar to see that the caste system lives and breathes inside the democratic system. We need to reinvent society.
Thank you, Professor Rajesh. And I cannot open my video. Venkat, brother, do you have a question? You're okay.
No. I think I forgot to lower my earlier I raised hand. So yeah, go ahead, Mahesh.
Yeah. So if anyone has any questions or comments, you are welcome. But we have like 10 more minutes. Before that, I have some reflections I wanted to share. The first one is like I was looking at the population of caste oppressed communities in India. It's around 70 to 80%, whereas the population of blacks in the US is around 12%. As a scholar, I see like when I moved to US a couple of years ago, I saw like more discussion, engagement on the question of bringing racial equity in the at least in the university system, and as well as in the policy field and even in the business sector. I was kind of shocked to know that, we don't have similar kind of conversation, even though the caste oppressed people's population is major, like majority in India. Like we don't have that kind of conversation. Like there is no caste, there is no critical caste theory. We are still discussing. There is still a lot of opposition to introduce critical caste theory in the Indian education syllabus. So yeah, this is just a reflection, and maybe you can comment on this. What's kind of missing in the academia, in the so-called educated spaces within the academia, policy, and business groups? Yeah, thank you.
This is a great, and Mahesh, if you can indulge me, I put my email address for those that want to reach out to me. I know we don't have time to continue, but people can reach out. And I want to draw you to the caste journal that Professor Simon and Professor Thorat in India created called Caste. And some of you, Gaurav, you just published in that. I saw that. I'm looking forward to reading your article. But Caste journal, I'm going to put that. The first 3 issues, I believe, my commentary began. I didn't have a chance to finish it, but I'm just going to put this one in the archives. Let's see, where is the first one? Yeah, it started in 2020, and you can see the beginnings of my commentary. I'll just put it here. But Mahesh, your question about, by virtue of being a person of color, son of Indian immigrants, came when I was 3 months old, never left really until much later for different reasons, but I can explain that. So I'm just discovering by my visits to India, spending time with the communities, feeling where I'm most comfortable, meeting different groups, particularly Christian, Muslim groups, Dalit groups. That if you look at the African American, Black Americans, 15%, Latinx is approaching 18%, people from Latin America. We don't say Hispanic, even though the census says that. And then Asian Americans like us, basically everything from Pakistan all the way to the Orient. Many Indians, that's true. We'll talk about that. Several Marxists indulge us. But critical caste theory, drawing from critical race theory in the US, is what I want to talk about. I think that's your question. We have to develop that. I don't see it existing if we use the principles of critical race theory. But in America, you have, Black American 15%, Latinx 18%, Asian American 7%. If you think of anti-Semitism, that's an enduring problem, obviously, a very scary problem that groups are trying attention to. 6 million Jewish Americans in the United States. What is that issue? The most hate crimes and incidents tracked by the FBI. So now I want to specify Gentile white Anglo-Saxon Protestant colonial roots, and then the other Western Europeans, and then eventually the Eastern European immigration groups, but anyone European white Gentile. So because the Jewish population also has their own issues of oppression. But Black and Latinx is approaching almost 35% of the population, but disproportionately criminalized. If you look at the wealth gap, and if you look at the criminal justice system, and if you think about positions of power, and if you think about representation in media and the academy, and then I want to move it over to India. So Modi, 2014 to now, obviously Congress for the most part, except BJP in the 90s, from 1948 to now. But let's just think of Manmohan Singh's time, 2000s. If you gave me the numbers, Mahesh, but I'm thinking, is it safe to say $250 to $300 million out of 1.3 billion? Can I say 70 million tribal? Can I say how many Shudra? It's not like Brahmins are 3%, so it can't be, they're the smallest. And then I think of 200 million plus Muslims behind Indonesia, second largest population in the world. Muslim majority countries throughout the Middle East and Africa. No, India is second. And then I think of how many millions of Christians. Don't know the numbers for Buddhists. So as a collective, what we have is the compounded problem of the the ethno-nationalists. It could be white nationalism in the United States, Hindu nationalism in India. You have the ideological infrastructure to protect the positions of power, and you have a base of people who are facing the most injustice, facing the lack of opportunity and the most criminalization. It's not quite legalized apartheid. That's why Bonilla Silva is important, but we're moving into some other scary structure. And for me, the only way to dismantle that is to, if we look at the tools of critical race theory, which I had to teach, which I had to learn, and which I really am trying to look at the next generation that's emerging. What are the issues for that group? Can we transfer that to the critical caste theory? I know the comment mentioned a number of a new generation of excellent scholars, but a critical caste theory has to do this. It has to look at the structural dimension by which distinctions of pure and impure get replicated, not in religion, because as you all know, the Western boundaries of religion and culture and race, these distinct categories become very blurry in the pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial South Asian context, particularly the Indian context. You can't make an easy separation between these things. And that's the ingenious nature of the defense that Hinduism makes. It has a transcendental, super consciousness, enlightened history of enlightened views and traditions about what's built into the very culture of the people that again gets mythologized and perhaps racialized and Aryanized. If I think of Golbachar and Sarvarkar, and if you read those texts that the RSS picks up on, that how it gets rationalized. That's what we have to understand. And if we can deconstruct that structure and truly at least start with one belief that you need for a democratic system. If you don't have that, then you're a fake democracy. You really have to believe in individual equality. I don't see any difference between myself, regardless of how I look or what my birth is or what my caste is. It's not Brahmin, I'll tell you that. If anything, it's Shudra and then borderline OBC too. But I'm definitely not at the top there. I have to go around the world, and that's why I'm so aligned with Du Bois, trying to draw strength from this position to advance this notion of the individual being seen and treated equally. That's all Ambedkar fought for. And my feeling is that whether it's the minority experience here or the caste experience in India and everywhere, and the racialized minorities everywhere, is that society and states, generally speaking, this is a strong word, collude in a way to preserve the privilege of those that get to utilize those structures for their own benefit. That's a very harsh condemnation of democracies, but I kind of have some empirical basis to say that. Just go look around what's happening in Western Europe with the right wing. Or how come a guy like Trump got elected here? What is the fate of this BJP in the Indian context? What's the truth of it? So I'll pause there. Thank you. Sanjay, please.
Thank you, Dr. Raj. It is really enthralling session. So many new things we learn about, and that is the advantage of having the academician delivering the lectures. A lot of knowledge goes into that one. So during your speech, you touch briefly about the environmental racism, and I would like to know a little bit more about that concept and how, from the caste perspective, that is it is getting impacted.
Yes, that's an excellent question. I'll take Jagannatha as well, and I know that. Please, I'm encouraging everyone to look at the chats. Dumont, I've drawn a lot. Even Levi Strauss. There's plenty of Western thinkers who looked at caste, and of course, Ambedkar himself, one of the great architects. But I'm keeping mine for the chat. Before I get to Sanjay's environmental racism question, Jagannatha.
Yeah, my apologies for joining late. Thanks for this wonderful dialogue. I have a feeling, I would like to go through your article fully. Thanks for your email and the article. I could just browse. Rajesh, could you kindly throw some light? See, the new dynamics in the human welfare is climate change and the disasters and pandemics. So taking these three parameters, I think the community enabling will cut through all these caste, race, and economical distinctions and things like that. This may look very generalized one, but I have a strong feeling. Look at Bangladesh. For example, 70% of the year they have climate impacts. And I will just mention one case. A squatter in Dhaka, he doesn't have a ownership of land, and he doesn't have any house, but he has got a solar trapping equipment and sells electricity worth 15,000 taka for the government. So what I want to say, survival rhythms, survival strategies are breaking all these social compartmentalizations, and they're making people come together. You see, if there's a climate change, you cannot distinguish between caste, creed, religion. When see, for example, I'll just conclude by saying that Al Gore was very silent in 1992. Now he is saying that every third American is affected by climate change. You see, and I get emails that Al Gore team ask me, "Where's some money?" You see. I say, I'm a pensioner, and you expect money from me when your carbon footprint is nowhere near to my carbon footprint. You see, the new yardsticks, the parameters will be, say, carbon footprint, the imbalances. The Europeans and Americans have looted Asia and Africa and America, and there is an imbalance. That's why J.B., Dr. Ambedkar is very relevant here, who said inequality challenges well-being. Inequality challenges well-being. I think we believers of Buddhism and Ambedkar thoughts should understand this inequality which is being perpetuated. I want to close by saying that Barbados PM is very subtle and clear. If pandemic can eat away $5 trillion from a global economy of $25 trillion, the well-being is challenged because of the inequality. Nobody is speaking on the arms being systematically pumped into Africa, and small groups, youths fight each other, you see, and we speak of climate carbon neutral and things like that. I think we who are scientific researchers from a social perspective should look at this community enabling and how communities are living through this caste, creed, and religion. I think time has come now.
Thank you, Jagannath. That's such an optimistic perspective, and I do talk to people about that. We have to, because climate change from the local level to the global level is a global phenomenon. It's obviously not, it's occurring everywhere. It's going to require the collective response. And because of the urgency, the definition of sustainability in 1987 Brundtland is like fulfilling the needs of the present generation without sacrificing future generations to achieve theirs. And this urgency may be able to break down the barriers of race, whether it's in the Western context or caste. The peso-optimist position, we may have joined late, but in the presentation, we talked about different views of progress, whether it's anti-caste or anti-racism, is that, well, unfortunately, still, the pessimistic view or the cynical view is that there's still monopolistic structures within capitalism that reproduces itself intergenerationally. That means one group is always going to be protected. In the future, those that can do the space flights or protect themselves or privatize the use of air and water, because that's going to happen next, that those groups that have the levers of power and economics will look out for themselves, because that's just the history of human instincts, and people just look out for their own groups. And therefore, in that you could see this type of economic apartheid that occurs, let's say in the US, or the landfills and the slums and the pollutions, that the most vulnerable, Katrina here in the United States, think of the landfills and the slums, who are the most impacted. So the thinking behind capitalism, if you want to talk about a religious aspect of capitalism, is that it's willing to drive itself. You know, religions are supposed to save everyone in one way or another. It's supposed to be the salvation of a people or all of humanity, if it's a universalist religion. Capitalism wants to raise everyone out of poverty. But in fact, you know, if it's also willing to push us to the brink of extinction, not just through industrialization and fossil fuels, but because it's willing to sacrifice the resources of the earth for the benefit of the few that can build a bridge externally, I have to think of, in your line of thinking, could there be another event? And this is going to sound very strange coming from an academic or anyone. But because these guys like Musk and Bezos, or the private sector is getting involved in space travel, not just for the exploration of space and inhabitation, perhaps the conquest of trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of minerals that are out there in space that will make the diamond look like nothing here on Earth. But I'm really concerned if it's possible about this pervasive discourse of extraterrestrial aliens, because that is an event that, if that were to occur, I'm not saying it will, I'm not saying how I feel about it, so I just put that out there and we're on YouTube. But the fact that people are talking about it as an example of something that goes beyond Earth and our human species and all of our diversity and all of our troubled histories and wars from since we came around 2 million years ago, and then 200,000 years ago we got organized, and our ancestors and Neanderthals, they disappeared. Rain storage 7,000 BC, Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. Civilizations 3,000, 5,000, all over the world, all the ancient, even the Hindus, say with the Vedas, ancient civilizations, that if you come to now, we still have not had an extraterrestrial event of life contact us or make themselves known. That will push us in two directions, either the pessimistic, cynical view that we'll fight amongst ourselves to figure out what to do, or a collectivity can emerge. And I bring that up because the multilateral institutions after the atrocities of World War II, UN, and then the financial institutions, they were all born, you know, during the decolonization period, during the end of the World War, beginning of the Cold War. I think we need to come up with another global federal structure together. It sounds like science fiction, but one that puts the human dignity not just at the center like the UN Declaration did, but in practice, to look out for these 21st century apocalyptic events, not post-World War II, and then the Cold War with the nuclear bombs, but something further. That's where I want to end on the optimistic note, that if we take on climate change and take on this question of a global kind of alliance about extra threats that could hit the Earth, mostly through climate change, then maybe that'll make us work together more peacefully.
Thank you, Rajesh. I just want to take 30 seconds more. I find a change because in 1990s, we had 70,000 nuclear warheads. So today, the counter space is becoming very, very apparent. and we have about 14,000 nuclear warheads all over the world with chemical and biological and such warfares. What I want to say, UNIDIR, for example, is systematically monitoring these threats in the form of various arsenal. And to me, it's an indication. In spite of all the difficulties under the UN and WHO, it is making the community enable for space security, for its very well-being. See, for example, for 3 years, I'm a part of infodemic management of WHO. The faith-based organizations, the voluntary groups are making that, look, if we don't have Earth, where should we keep our life on? So there is an element of realization that I call mindfulness. That's where Buddha is alive. You see, when you have a systematic analyzing power built within an individual, see, as you know, all religions are after the death of some visionary. But what the question is today, well, if Buddha and Ambedkar are in the past, they responded for the time being. That time being. But what is it we are going to do? Because we are having finite earth, finite resources, finite energy, everything finite. But politics, what is politics? Having control over resources. Why shouldn't common man have control over resources? So such things are interpretations I can think of Buddhism and Ambedkar vision. So thank you very much for throwing light on this.
Thank you, Jagannathan, for the inspiring remarks. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I'll defer back to Mahesh and Sanjay for a conclusion.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Rajesh, and thanks all the participants. We have more questions, we have more things to think, and it's time to go back and read Ambedkar again. So with that note, I would wholehearted thanks to Professor Rajesh for your time, insights, and we are looking forward to engage more with you in future conversations. That